This story begins quietly, not with romance, not with longing glances or whispered promises, but with a very different understanding of what it meant to share a life with another person. When we hear the word dating today, we often imagine choice, personal freedom, and emotional connection. We think of two people meeting, speaking, discovering each other slowly, guided by feelings. But if we step back into medieval Europe, this idea almost completely disappears. There was no clear moment called dating. There was no expectation that love should come first. For most people, love was something that might arrive later, or might never arrive at all. In medieval times, relationships were shaped by survival, not by emotion. Life was uncertain. Food could be scarce. Disease was common. War and hardship were always nearby. In such a world, marriage was not about finding happiness. It was about creating stability. It was about joining families, securing land, protecting lineage, and ensuring that daily life could continue without falling apart. People did not usually ask, "Do I love this person?" Instead, the question was, "Will this marriage keep us alive? Will it protect our family's reputation? Will it help us endure the coming winter, the next harvest, the next illness?" These were practical concerns, quiet but powerful, shaping nearly every decision. For many medieval men and women, their future partner was chosen long before they were ready to understand what marriage meant. Parents, relatives, local customs, and social expectations guided the process. Personal desire remained in the background, soft and often unspoken. This does not mean medieval people were cold or incapable of affection. They laughed, worried, hoped, and dreamed, just as people do now. But their emotions lived within firm boundaries. Feelings had to follow duty, not lead it. Love, if it appeared, was something to grow into slowly, like a plant surviving between stones. As we move gently through this story, imagine a world without privacy, without easy choice, and without the idea that love must come first. Imagine relationships shaped by routine, obligation, and patience. This is not a story meant to shock, but to quietly reveal how differently people once lived and how their understanding of connection grew from the ground of necessity. And so, with this calm beginning, we step into the first part of our journey, where marriage came before love and survival shaped every bond. In medieval society, marriage was not the beginning of a love story. It was the foundation of daily life. For most people, it functioned more like a long-term agreement than a romantic union. Two individuals did not simply come together, two families did. The goal was not emotional fulfillment, but balance and continuity. Among peasants, marriage helped ensure that land could be worked, animals cared for, and households maintained. A man and a woman were expected to contribute labor, not feelings. Their partnership was practical. Each person brought skills that helped the household survive. Love, if it grew, came quietly over time, shaped by shared effort rather than grand expression. For nobles, marriage carried even greater weight. It was tied to power, inheritance, and political strategy. Land passed through families, and marriage ensured that property remained secure. A suitable match could strengthen alliances, settle disputes, or increase influence. In such cases, personal preference mattered very little. Stability came first. Children were often promised in marriage at a young age, long before they understood the meaning of such arrangements. These agreements were usually made by parents or guardians, guided by social standing and long-term benefit. The future husband or wife was known as a role rather than a person, someone who would fulfill a duty when the time came. Because of this, Medieval people did not expect marriage to provide emotional happiness. That expectation simply did not exist in the same way it does today. Instead, marriage was seen as a framework within which life could unfold. Emotional closeness was uncertain, but routine was guaranteed. Daily life within marriage followed predictable patterns. Work began early. Meals were simple. Evenings were quiet. Privacy was rare, especially in peasant homes where entire families shared a single space. Intimacy was not something spoken about openly. It existed, but it remained largely unexpressed in words. Women, in particular, had limited influence over marital decisions. Their role was shaped by tradition and law. Marriage often meant leaving one household and entering another, adapting to new expectations and responsibilities. Love, if it came, arrived slowly, built from familiarity rather than choice. Men also carried heavy expectations. They were responsible for providing stability, labor, and protection. Emotional expression was restrained. Marriage was a responsibility first, an identity second, and a relationship only afterward. What is striking is not that medieval marriages lacked love, but that love was not required. Endurance mattered more. Trust developed through shared hardship. Two people learned to coexist, to cooperate, and sometimes to care deeply. But this care was quiet and uncelebrated. Stories from the period suggest that affection often grew through repetition rather than passion. Sharing meals, raising children, surviving winters together, and managing loss created bonds that were strong, even if they were never named as love. In this world, romance did not guide marriage. Instead, marriage shaped whatever form of romance might eventually exist. The relationship was built slowly, like a path worn into the ground by daily footsteps, steady and unremarkable, yet lasting. As this part of the story gently settles, it leaves us with an understanding that medieval relationships were not empty of feeling. They were simply grounded in a different set of priorities. Love was not the door one entered through, but sometimes the quiet room discovered much later inside. In medieval society, the question of who you would marry was rarely yours to answer. Choice, as we understand it today, was a quiet and distant idea. Instead, decisions about marriage moved through families, customs, and communities, settling into place long before the individuals involved had much awareness of what was happening. For most people, parents stood at the center of this process. Marriage was seen as too important to leave to youth or emotion. Parents carried the responsibility of protecting family stability, reputation, and survival. They looked at land, skills, alliances, and social standing, weighing each factor carefully. A good match was one that reduced risk, not one that stirred the heart. In rural villages, this process often felt practical rather than formal. Families knew each other well. They worked the same fields, attended the same church, and depended on one another during difficult seasons. When a son or daughter reached a suitable age, parents quietly observed which households might make sense. A marriage could mean shared labor, stronger harvests, and mutual support during illness or loss. In this environment, marriage was less about two individuals meeting and more about two households fitting together. Compatibility was measured through daily life. Could these families cooperate? Would they help each other during hard winters? Would the union strengthen both sides? These were the silent questions guiding decisions. Among the nobility, the process was far more structured, yet equally distant from personal desire. Marriages were arranged through negotiations that resembled careful planning rather than celebration. Families considered wealth, titles, land boundaries, and long-term political advantage. A noble child might grow up knowing their future spouse in name only, with little sense of who that person truly was. These arrangements were not always cruel, but they were rarely flexible. Once agreed upon, they carried strong social and legal weight. Breaking an engagement could damage reputation and invite conflict between families. As a result, even when doubts existed, they were often set aside for the greater good of the family line. The wider community also played a quiet role in shaping these choices. Medieval life unfolded in close quarters. Everyone knew everyone else's business. Reputation mattered deeply. A family known for honesty, hard work, and obedience was more likely to secure favorable matches. A family marked by conflict or scandal faced greater difficulty. This communal awareness meant that romantic secrecy was almost impossible. Courtship, when it existed, happened in public spaces. Parents, neighbors, and church authorities all observed interactions. In many ways, the community acted as a silent guardian, ensuring that relationships followed accepted norms. Religion further reinforced this structure. The church viewed marriage as a serious and sacred bond, one that required order and approval. While clergy did not arrange marriages directly in every case, their teachings shaped how people understood marital duty. Obedience, modesty, and social harmony were emphasized over personal longing. For young people, this system created a strange mixture of certainty and uncertainty. Their future was planned, yet emotionally unclear. They knew marriage was coming, but they did not know what kind of relationship it would bring. Feelings were something to be discovered later, if at all. This did not mean young people were entirely passive. Small acts of preference existed. A glance held a little longer. A conversation remembered. A song sung with special attention. These moments, however, remained secondary. They could soften a match, but they rarely defined it. In many cases, the first real conversations between future spouses happened after agreements were already made. Familiarity grew slowly. Two people learned each other's habits, silences, and routines over time. Affection, when it appeared, was shaped by shared experience rather than anticipation. From a modern perspective, this may feel restrictive. But within medieval society, it was considered responsible. Life offered little room for risk. Allowing emotions to guide such an important decision felt dangerous. Stability protected not just individuals, but entire households. As we sit quietly with this idea, it becomes clear that marriage in medieval times belonged more to the family than to the couple. Love was not ignored, but it was expected to follow structure, not challenge it. Choice existed, but it moved slowly, softly, and often in the background. In the next part of this story, we will see how these arranged paths unfolded in daily life, where interactions happened under watchful eyes, and where privacy was a rare and valuable thing. In medieval times, getting to know another person happened very differently from how we imagine it today. There were no quiet dinners for two, no private walks chosen freely, and no expectation that feelings should be explored in isolation. Courtship, when it existed at all, unfolded in public spaces, shaped by routine and observation. Daily life offered few places to be alone. Homes were crowded, villages were small, work was shared. From sunrise to sunset, people moved through the same spaces together. As a result, any interaction between unmarried men and women was visible, noticed, and often discussed. Privacy was not a natural part of life. It was a rare condition. Most social interaction happened in settings tied to necessity. The church was one of the most common meeting places. People gathered regularly, standing close, listening, watching. A glance exchanged during a sermon or a brief conversation after prayers might be as close as courtship came. These moments were quiet and controlled, shaped by respect and restraint. Festivals and market days offered another opportunity. These events broke the routine of labor and brought people together for trade, celebration, and rest. Music played softly. Food was shared. Laughter filled the air. Within these gatherings, young people could observe one another more freely, though still under watchful eyes. A dance might allow brief closeness, but it remained guided by custom and supervision. Work itself also created space for interaction. In fields, workshops, and shared labor, people learned each other's rhythms and strengths. Courtship, in this sense, was less about spoken intention and more about observation. Who worked steadily, who treated others with patience, who carried responsibility quietly. These traits mattered more than charm or display. Because of constant supervision, expressions of affection were subtle. A shared smile, a kind word remembered, a small favor offered during work. These gestures carried meaning precisely because they were restrained. Too much attention could invite gossip, and gossip carried real consequences. Reputation was fragile. A single rumor could damage a family's standing and affect future marriage prospects. As a result, young people learned to move carefully. Emotional impulses were managed with discipline. Feelings were acknowledged inwardly, but rarely expressed outwardly. This environment shaped how relationships developed. Instead of intense emotional exchanges, bonds formed slowly through familiarity. Seeing the same person each day, watching how they behaved under pressure, and sharing routines created a different kind of intimacy. It was quieter, steadier, and deeply connected to daily life. Among the nobility, privacy was slightly more available, but still limited. Courtly spaces allowed for formal interaction, yet even here, behavior followed strict codes. Conversations were polite and measured. Letters, when exchanged, were often read by others or written with great care. Language was indirect, layered with symbolism and restraint. Songs and poetry sometimes served as a safe outlet for emotion. Love could be expressed through metaphor rather than confession. These artistic forms allowed feelings to exist without disrupting social order. Even then, such expressions were often idealized rather than personal. For many medieval people, courtship was not a separate phase of life. It blended into work, worship, and routine. There was no clear beginning or end. Relationships grew within shared spaces, guided by patience rather than urgency. This lack of privacy may seem restrictive, yet it also shaped a different understanding of connection. People learned to read small signals, to value consistency over excitement, and to find meaning in presence rather than declaration. As we move gently forward, it becomes clear that medieval relationships were not built in isolation. They belonged to the community, shaped by shared space and shared watchfulness. In the next part, we will turn our attention to how these structures affected women's lives in particular, and how choice, duty, and adaptation defined their experiences. In medieval society, women's lives were shaped by expectations that began early and changed very slowly. From childhood, girls learned where they stood within family and community. Their future was not presented as something to discover, but something to step into when the time came. Marriage was one of the central paths laid before them, not as a choice to explore, but as a role to accept. For most women, marriage marked a transition from one household to another. It was less a personal journey than a social movement. A daughter left her parents' home and entered the world of her husband's family, where she was expected to adapt quickly. Her success was measured by how smoothly she fit into existing routines, how well she worked, and how quietly she carried responsibility. Legal and social structures offered women very little authority in choosing a partner. Decisions were made by fathers, guardians, or family elders. These choices were justified as protection. In a world where survival was uncertain, it was believed that experienced adults knew best how to secure a stable future. Emotional preference was considered unreliable, especially for women, whose feelings were often viewed as something that needed guidance. Age also played an important role. Many women married young, sometimes in their mid-teens. At that age, the idea of shaping one's own future was distant and abstract. Marriage arrived as part of growing up, much like learning a trade or taking on household duties. It was expected, not questioned. Once married, a woman's daily life revolved around work that rarely paused. She prepared food, managed supplies, cared for children, and supported agricultural or domestic labor. Her contribution was essential, yet often unnoticed. Love, if present, existed quietly beneath these tasks, expressed through reliability rather than words. Despite these limits, medieval women were not without agency. Their influence simply moved along different paths. Within the household, women often managed resources, made practical decisions, and maintained social connections. They understood the rhythms of daily life deeply and learned how to navigate relationships with care and patience. In some cases, women formed strong emotional bonds with their husbands over time. Shared hardship created trust. Facing illness, loss, and uncertainty together allowed affection to grow slowly. These relationships were not built on expectation, but on endurance. For noble women, the situation was different in detail, but similar in structure. Their marriages were tied to political strategy and family alliances. They were trained to represent their households with grace and restraint. Personal desire remained secondary. Their role was to maintain continuity, produce heirs, and strengthen social ties. Yet even within these constraints, noble women sometimes found ways to shape their environment. Through correspondence, patronage, and careful diplomacy, they exercised quiet influence. Their emotional lives were private but not absent. It is important to understand that medieval society did not see this imbalance as unjust. It was viewed as natural order. Stability depended on clear roles. Questioning those roles risked disrupting the fragile balance of daily life. From a modern perspective, this lack of choice can feel heavy. But within the medieval world, it was normalized through routine and tradition. Women learned to measure fulfillment differently. Security, respect, and belonging often mattered more than personal expression. This does not mean that women were indifferent to love. Songs, stories, and religious writings from the period suggest deep emotional awareness. But these feelings were guided inward, shaped by patience and acceptance rather than pursuit. As we reflect on women's experiences, we see a pattern of quiet adaptation. Life did not offer many open doors, but within the spaces available, women learned how to live fully, though silently. Their stories unfold not in dramatic gestures, but in steady presence. This understanding helps us see medieval relationships more clearly. They were not empty of feeling, but they were structured in ways that limited how feelings could be expressed. In the next part, we will gently turn our attention to the expectations placed on men and how duty shaped their emotional lives as well. As evening approached and the body began to slow, another force remained constant and unchanged throughout the day. This force did not depend on weather, strength, or effort. It was present from birth and followed each person through every stage of life. The social order of feudal Japan shaped how people moved, spoke, worked, and imagined their future. Society was arranged in clear layers, and each layer carried its own rules. These divisions were not abstract ideas. They were felt daily in clothing, speech, labor, and access to resources. A person did not need to be reminded of their place. The world around them reflected it continuously. For most people, birth determined nearly everything. Occupation, expectations, and limits were inherited rather than chosen. A farmer's child grew up among fields and tools. An artisan's child learned specific skills through observation and repetition. The path ahead was visible early, and deviation was rare. Movement between classes was extremely limited. Stories of change existed, but they were exceptions remembered precisely because they were unusual. For the majority, stability meant remaining where one had always been. Ambition was not framed as reaching upward, but as fulfilling one's role well enough to avoid trouble. Rules governed behavior carefully. Who could wear certain fabrics, carry certain items, or speak in particular ways was defined clearly. These boundaries reduced uncertainty, but also narrowed expression. Individual preference mattered less than maintaining order. Respect flowed upward. Authority was rarely questioned openly. Obedience was not simply expected, it was taught as necessary for harmony. Even when rules felt heavy, resistance carried risks that few could afford. Community reinforced this structure. Neighbors observed one another. Behavior reflected not only on the individual, but on the household. Reputation mattered deeply. Acting outside expectation could bring social isolation or punishment. Education followed similar patterns. Knowledge passed through families or guilds. Literacy existed, but it was unevenly distributed. Learning was practical, tied to survival rather than exploration. Curiosity was guided toward usefulness. Emotionally, people learned to regulate desire. Wanting too much was dangerous. Contentment, or at least the appearance of it, offered safety. Acceptance became a skill, practiced quietly over time. The social order also shaped how people viewed authority figures. Lords, officials, and warriors occupied distant roles. Their decisions affected daily life, but their presence was often indirect. Power was felt more than seen. This distance encouraged caution. People learned when to speak and when to remain silent. Words were chosen carefully. Silence often communicated more effectively than complaint. Within families, hierarchy repeated itself. Elders guided decisions. Younger members listened. This structure provided continuity, but limited individual expression. Life unfolded within familiar patterns. As night settled, these boundaries did not loosen. Even in private spaces, social roles remained intact. Dreams did not always challenge reality. For many, imagination adjusted itself to fit what was possible. Living within fixed boundaries did not mean constant suffering. It meant predictability. Knowing what was expected reduced uncertainty. Yet this predictability came at the cost of freedom. Over time, people learned to measure success differently, not by change or advancement, but by stability, avoiding conflict, maintaining balance, continuing within one's place. In feudal Japan, social order was not a backdrop. It was a daily presence, quiet, firm, and rarely questioned. Survival depended not only on physical strength, but on understanding where one stood and moving carefully within those limits. As the day moved toward its later hours, the presence of authority remained steady, even when it was not visible. In feudal Japan, law did not announce itself loudly or constantly. It existed in the background, shaping choices through memory, reputation, and quiet caution. Most people did not encounter officials or punishment daily, yet the influence of authority guided behavior from morning until night. Rules were deeply woven into everyday life. They governed movement, conduct, and obligation. People learned these rules not through written codes, but through observation and experience. What could be done safely was understood through stories, warnings, and the visible consequences faced by others. Punishment, when it occurred, was severe enough to discourage resistance. This severity reduced the need for frequent enforcement. Fear did not need to be refreshed daily. It lingered naturally. Knowing that consequences could be harsh was enough to encourage compliance. Authority was layered, much like society itself. Local officials represented higher powers. Village leaders carried responsibility for maintaining order. Families were held accountable collectively. This structure meant that individual actions could affect many others. As a result, restraint became a form of protection. People learned to regulate themselves carefully. Words were measured. Movements were controlled. Public behavior followed established patterns. Drawing attention rarely brought benefit. Remaining unnoticed offered safety. Justice, as experienced by ordinary people, was not about fairness in the modern sense. It was about maintaining stability. The goal was not to examine every situation deeply, but to preserve order. Efficiency mattered more than nuance. Fear was not always sharp or immediate. It was often dull and familiar, like the awareness of weather or hunger. People carried it quietly, adjusting their behavior without conscious thought. This constant awareness shaped posture, tone, and decision-making. Disputes were often resolved informally to avoid drawing authority into private matters. Community mediation was preferred. Escalation increased risk. Silence and compromise protected everyone involved. Travel beyond one's village carried additional uncertainty. Laws varied by region. Permissions were required. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time could lead to questioning or suspicion. For most people, staying close to home felt safer. Authority figures themselves were distant. Many people would go their entire lives without direct contact with higher officials. Yet their influence was felt in taxes, labor demands, and restrictions. Power operated through structure rather than presence. This distance made authority feel abstract but unavoidable. Decisions came from above, often without explanation. Acceptance was not always agreement, but resistance was rarely practical. Children absorbed these realities early. They watched adults lower their voices, pause before speaking, and show respect automatically. Fear was not taught directly. It was learned through example. As evening approached and daily labor slowed, authority did not disappear. Curfews, expectations, and boundaries remained. Night did not offer freedom. It simply shifted the form of vigilance. Emotionally, this environment encouraged caution over expression. People learned when to stop themselves before crossing invisible lines. Survival depended as much on restraint as on effort. Law and authority were not experienced as constant oppression, but as a framework that limited possibility. Within that framework, people learned how to move carefully. Over time, this careful movement became instinct. In feudal Japan, order was not maintained through constant force, but through understanding. Knowing what could happen was enough. Fear did not dominate every thought, but it quietly guided behavior, shaping lives without needing to announce itself. As daylight faded and work slowed, the body carried more than fatigue. It carried the quiet awareness of its own limits. In feudal Japan, health was never taken for granted. The body was the most important tool a person had, yet it was also the most vulnerable. Without it, survival became uncertain very quickly. Medical knowledge existed, but it was limited and unevenly available. Treatments were shaped by tradition, observation, and belief rather than systematic understanding. Some remedies offered relief, others did little. Many conditions were accepted rather than treated, simply because there were few alternatives. Infections that seem minor today could become life-threatening. A small cut, a blister, or a burn could lead to serious complications. Without effective ways to control infection, the body had to rely on its own strength. Sometimes it was enough, often it was not. Injuries were common, especially among those who worked with tools, animals, or heavy labor. Strains, fractures, and wounds accumulated over time. Healing was slow. Returning to work too early was common, not because people ignored pain, but because they could not afford rest. Illness did not arrive dramatically. It crept in quietly. Weakness, fever, or persistent pain. These signs were watched carefully, but without certainty. The line between manageable discomfort and serious danger was thin and often unclear. Children were especially vulnerable. Disease spread easily in close living conditions. Many did not survive early childhood. Families learned to hold affection gently, aware of loss but continuing forward. Life expectancy was shorter than what we know today. This was understood, though not calculated in numbers. Aging was visible in posture, movement, and energy. Bodies showed wear early. Few expected long years of comfort. Pain was a regular companion. It was not always named or discussed. Complaints offered little relief. Endurance was valued quietly, not praised loudly. Strength was shown by continuing, not by speaking. Care came primarily from family and community. When someone fell ill, others adjusted. Work was redistributed. Meals were shared. Support existed, but it was limited by resources. Compassion did not create abundance. Death was present, but not always dramatic. It occurred at home, among familiar surroundings. Rituals provided structure and meaning, helping communities process loss without halting daily life entirely. Emotionally, this environment encouraged acceptance. Fear existed, but panic was rare. People understood that health was uncertain, control was limited, attention focused on what could be done rather than what could not. Spiritual beliefs offered comfort and explanation. Illness was often seen as part of a larger pattern. This perspective softened anxiety, allowing people to continue without constant dread. As night settled, bodies rested with awareness of their fragility. Sleep did not erase pain or guarantee recovery. It simply allowed the body a chance to continue. In this world, survival depended on resilience more than treatment. Healing was slow, uncertain, and incomplete. Yet life continued, carried by habit, care, and quiet strength. As the day drew toward its end and physical movement slowed, another form of endurance became more noticeable. It was not visible in muscles or tools, but in thought, emotion, and quiet restraint. In feudal Japan, inner life was shaped by necessity just as much as by belief. The mind learned to adapt to limits long before it learned to imagine alternatives. Life offered few choices. Paths were set early. Expectations were clear. Within these boundaries, people learned not to measure happiness by change or personal fulfillment. Instead, stability became the goal. Continuing without disruption mattered more than expressing dissatisfaction. Emotions were not ignored, but they were managed carefully. Open complaint risked conflict or punishment. Silence often felt safer. Over time, restraint became habitual. Feelings were contained rather than resolved. Belief systems offered a framework for acceptance. Ideas about impermanence, duty, and balance helped people interpret hardship. Suffering was not always seen as unfair, but as part of existence. This perspective did not remove pain, but it softened resistance to it. Daily routines supported mental stability. Familiar tasks created structure. Repetition reduced uncertainty. Knowing what came next provided comfort, even when what came next was difficult. Community also played a role. Shared experience reduced isolation. People rarely faced hardship alone. Even without direct discussion, awareness of collective endurance offered reassurance. Leisure, as we imagine it now, was limited. Moments of rest existed, but they were brief and unremarkable. Simple pleasures came from conversation, seasonal change, or quiet observation. These moments did not distract from hardship, but they balanced it gently. Dreams and ambitions were shaped to fit reality. Wanting too much created tension. Contentment was learned gradually, through adjustment rather than fulfillment. Reflection often occurred in still moments, walking familiar paths, sitting quietly at day's end, watching light fade. These moments allowed the mind to settle without forcing resolution. Children absorbed these patterns naturally. They learned not through instruction, but through observation. Emotional control became part of maturity. Fear, uncertainty, and hope existed together. None fully dominated. Life continued within this emotional balance, steady and contained. As night deepened, the mind prepared for rest. Thoughts slowed, worries remained, but they softened. Sleep offered temporary release, not escape, and that was enough. Mental endurance did not require optimism, it required acceptance. In this way, inner life supported survival just as physical strength did. As the day finally reached its close, there was no dramatic ending, no clear sense of accomplishment, no moment where effort transformed into reward. What remained instead was something much quieter. The simple fact of having made it through another day. In feudal Japan, survival was not measured by progress or improvement. It was measured by continuity, waking up again, returning to familiar paths, holding the body together long enough to repeat what had already been done countless times before. This repetition was not failure, it was achievement. History often remembers moments of change, battles, rulers, reforms, and turning points. But most lives did not intersect with these events in meaningful ways. The majority of people lived within the same patterns year after year. Their stories were not written because they did not interrupt history's direction. They sustained it. Each ordinary day required coordination between body, environment, and community. Food had to last. Work had to be completed. Relationships had to remain stable. Illness had to be endured. Authority had to be navigated carefully. None of these tasks alone defined success, but together they formed a delicate balance that could easily collapse. Survival demanded attention without constant reflection. Thinking too far ahead created anxiety. Dwelling too long on hardship offered no relief. People learned to stay close to the present. Today's work, today's meal, today's rest. The absence of recorded names does not imply insignificance. These lives formed the foundation upon which everything else stood. Fields were planted, goods were produced, communities continued. Without this steady endurance, nothing celebrated by history could have existed. There was also dignity in this endurance, though it was rarely described that way at the time. Strength was shown through consistency. Care was shown through sharing limited resources. Responsibility was carried without recognition. As night settled and homes grew quiet, people did not reflect on whether their lives would matter beyond their village. That question did not shape their actions. What mattered was whether tomorrow could be faced with enough strength left to begin again. Survival required restraint, knowing when not to speak, when not to resist, when to conserve energy. These choices were not signs of weakness. They were adaptations learned over generations. Pain, loss, and uncertainty were familiar, but they were not constant emergencies. They were conditions of life. By accepting this, people reduced the emotional weight they carried. Endurance became normalized. From a modern perspective, this may appear limiting or bleak. Yet within this framework, people found meaning through connection, routine, and contribution. Life did not need to expand to feel complete. It needed to continue. As sleep approached, the body recognized the end of effort for now. Muscles loosened slightly. Breath slowed. Another day had been completed. No celebration marked the moment, but completion itself held value. Survival was not loud. It was not heroic. It was quiet and repetitive and deeply human. In feudal Japan, lasting another day was not a small thing. It was the central achievement of life. As the imagined day in feudal Japan comes to rest, there is no need to draw sharp lines between past and present. History does not end abruptly. It fades, much like the evening light that once slipped across wooden floors and paper screens, leaving behind a softer world shaped by shadow and stillness. The people we have followed through these sessions do not ask to be judged or compared. They do not need to be admired or pitied. Their lives were not designed to teach lessons. They were simply lived, one careful day at a time. What remains after listening is not a list of hardships, nor a catalog of suffering. What remains is a sense of rhythm, a pace of life that moved slowly because it had to. A way of existing where attention stayed close to the ground, close to the body, close to what was immediately necessary. In that closeness, there was a certain quiet strength, not dramatic, not celebrated, but reliable. It appeared each morning when someone stood up despite fatigue. It continued through the day in repeated tasks. It softened slightly at night, when effort paused and breath deepened. This kind of endurance does not demand memory. It does not require recognition. It simply continues, and in continuing, it sustains everything else. As listeners in the present, we are surrounded by choices, information, and constant movement. Our lives expand outward, pulling attention in many directions at once. Against that backdrop, the past can feel distant, even unreal. Yet the human body has not changed as much as the world around it. Fatigue still accumulates. Repetition still comforts. Routine still steadies the mind. Rest is still necessary. The people of feudal Japan did not have language for stress or mental overload, but they understood exhaustion deeply. They understood the need for quiet. They understood the relief of night. As darkness settled in their world, sounds softened. Tools were set aside. Movement slowed. The mind, trained by routine, knew what this stillness meant. It was time to stop asking effort from the body. Sleep did not promise escape. Tomorrow would bring the same demands. But sleep offered restoration, a brief return to balance. This is where the past gently meets the present. You do not need to imagine yourself surviving their life. You do not need to measure your strength against theirs. The value lies not in comparison, but in recognition. Humans have always lived with limits. They have always adapted. They have always rested when they could. The stories we rarely hear are not missing because they lack meaning. They are quiet because they were shared through action, not words, through continuity, not change. As this journey closes, there is no conclusion to reach, no lesson to summarize, no insight to hold tightly. There is only a gentle awareness that life has always required effort, and rest has always followed effort when possible. You are not carrying the weight of a feudal village. You are not bound by rigid hierarchies or seasonal survival. But you are still human, and your body still responds to calm in the same way theirs once did. Allow your attention to narrow now, just as theirs did at the end of the day. Let thoughts lose their urgency. Let the need to understand dissolve into simple presence. Breathing becomes slower without instruction. Muscles soften without command. The mind, no longer required to analyze or prepare, settles into quiet observation. The past recedes naturally, like footsteps fading down a familiar path. What remains is a sense of continuity, not between centuries, but between effort and rest. Another day in any era eventually comes to a close. And for now, that is enough.